O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals, that you care for them. The psalmist is overwhelmed with the beauty of creation, and at the same time, the psalmist is utterly perplexed at the notion that the one responsible for all this majesty could also be paying attention to him. In light of the vastness, magnificence, and sheer splendor of the natural world, it boggles one's mind to think that an individual life has significance and worth. Psalm 8 is a hymn of praise to God, but it is also a hymn of astonishment. You, O God, creator of all that is, you are paying attention to me. My life matters to you. You, O Lord, listen and care and love me. The psalmist is asking this question for himself and also for the entire human race. I read this just a few weeks ago. The Voyager 1 spacecraft was launched in 1977 for the specific purpose of taking photographs of Jupiter and Saturn. 1977. Voyager completed its mission and, of course, kept on moving along, and the spacecraft is now 11.66 billion miles from the sun. And believe it or not, it's still sending back faint signals using a 23-watt transmitter. Here's the truly amazing fact. Voyager is racing through space at 38,000 miles an hour. And it's taken 36 years for Voyager to reach the outer edges of the solar system, but it will not reach another star for 40,000 years. I don't think the transmitter will still be working at that point, and who cares? Among us, anyway. In this vast universe, it's very easy to feel small, inconsequential, and insignificant. It's easy to feel like a drop in the ocean. And this is what the psalmist is wrestling with. O Lord, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? And so it's no wonder that many of us yearn to be somebody. Many of you know or have heard of Glenn Henson. Some of you, I know him very well. Michelle McClendon helped arrange for Glenn Henson to be in our church for several weeks back in 2001. Henson is Emeritus Professor of Spirituality and Church History at the Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond. As stated on the back cover of his recently released autobiography, Henson has degrees from some of the world's most noted schools and has taught in some of the most distinguished educational institutions in our country. Do you know this part of Glenn Henson's story? He grew up in abject poverty. With a father who was an alcoholic, he was gentle and thoughtful when he was sober, but when he was drunk, Henson says, demons took control and made him an angry, abusive, impulse-driven madman who used his superior size and strength to manhandle his wife. In vivid and challenging, chilling detail, Henson recalls his earliest memories as a little boy, his earliest memories of verbal and physical fights between his mother and father. It's no wonder that immediately after Glenn Henson finished high school, he left home to look for a job. His dream was to make enough money to go to college and eventually become a lawyer. I was full of hope, he writes. Once I got my training as an attorney, I reckoned I would have money and prestige and I'm quoting here, and I would be somebody. Glenn Henson imagined that becoming a lawyer would give him the feeling of being somebody. If you're so inclined, you may insert your own lawyer joke at this point. Along the way, Glenn Henson's life was changed. It was transformed. He had certain experiences in his life, and more importantly, he encountered some very kind and gracious people who loved him, supported him, encouraged him, and accepted him for who he was. And he began to feel something that he had never felt before. In his innermost being, he began to experience the grace of God. He began to feel accepted for who he was, and the drive that he felt to be somebody began to melt away. I don't have the time this morning to tell much of his story, but I recommend his book to you. But the story is that over time, Glenn Henson became thoroughly convinced that indeed there is something or someone at the heart of things with which we human beings can commune. There is, as he writes, a divine mystery at the heart of the universe, beyond our comprehension, but nevertheless real. And Glenn was free. I was free, he writes, and able to lay aside that inner drive to be somebody. When you and I are straining to be somebody, we cannot admit weakness and pain. When being somebody is our primary goal, the last thing we can do is admit mistakes, flaws, insecurities, and inadequacies. The frantic pursuit of being somebody is a competitive stance in life. We are in fierce competition with everybody else who is trying to be somebody. At the heart of it all, Glenn Henson says, is our need to experience God's okaying of us, even though we are not okay. We are loved, even though sometimes we are anything but lovable. We are accepted, even though at times our behavior is anything but acceptable. And we are forgiven, even though we live in a constant state of sin. We live in a state of separation from our true selves and from each other and from God. We are separated. We are estranged from something to which we really belong and with which we long to be united, as Paul Tillich says. We live in sin, and yet we are accepted. It is the gift of God's okaying, even though we are not okay. If you are looking for something for which to be truly grateful this Thanksgiving season, the gift of God's okaying is at the top of the list. Striving to establish our own somebodyness is a constant and ultimately fruitless and destructive internal struggle. But experiencing God's okaying is a gift to be received. Where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. Paul Tillich calls these 7 words from the Apostle Paul the determining face of life, the core of the Christian understanding of life. Where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. Across the street from where Martin Luther King Jr. grew up, there was a small grocery store owned by a white family. They didn't live in the neighborhood, but they owned this little grocery store. The owner of the store had a son who was the same age as young Martin. And from ages 3 to 6, these two young boys played together nearly every day. They were best friends. At age 6, the boys went to different elementary schools, one for white children and one for black children. And soon afterwards, the white boy's parents informed young Martin that he was no longer to play with their son, his best friend. But why? Young Martin asked. Why? And the father of Martin's best friend said, "Martin, it's just because we are white and you are colored." That night, as they sat around the dinner table, Martin told his parents what had happened. And they tried to find words to comfort their devastated little boy. They tried to help him begin to understand the tragic history of blacks in America. He was only 6 years old. At the end of the conversation, Martin's mother, Alberta King, said these words to her son: "Martin, you must never feel that you are less than anybody. You must always feel that you are somebody." And for the rest of his life, in speeches and in sermons, Martin Luther King Jr. recounted this story and proclaimed this message. He said, "So if you're worried about your somebodyness, don't worry about it any longer, because God fixed it a long time ago. God said, 'I'm making all of my children in my image, and I will declare that every child of mine has dignity, and every child of mine has worth.'" God's gift of okaying, even though we are not okay. Where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. And that is what this table is all about.